Okay. So my name is Tyler Salath. Like I mentioned, I'm a student at George Washington University. It's currently August 26, 2015. I'm interviewing Richard Pournelle for the 2015 NASA Astrobiology Debates. Richard is the Senior Vice President of Business Development at NanoRacks, a private company providing mounted facilities and space access to commercial customers at the ISS. Again, I'd like to thank you, Richard, for taking the time to sit down and have this discussion with me. We're here today to discuss a topic that was prepared in partnership with the NASA Astrobiology program. The topic is resolved an overriding ethical obligation to protect and preserve extraterrestrial microbial life and ecosystems should be incorporated into international law. This sentiment, I believe, is summed up by Carl Sagan's quote from 1985, which states, "If there's life on Mars, I believe we should do nothing with Mars. Mars then belongs to the Martians." So starting our discussion off broadly as Vice President of Business Development, Richard, I'd like to ask you what your initial thoughts are on the resolution coming from someone working with government, but then more focused on the private sector and what those consequences might become in the future.
Well, thanks for having me, and I really appreciate the chance to do this. And like I said, as a former debater, this is a great opportunity to be part of this. So I think there's only so much money that the government can devote towards space exploration. If you look at the amount of money that the government spends on many endeavors, it is dwarfed by orders of magnitude by what the private sector spends in different areas. So, for example, in air transportation, initially the government helped to develop the market, but long term there was always going to be more capital and more money to be earned, and a much bigger market that could exist on a private level than ever could by just supporting exploration or government. And I think we have to look at space as just simply a place like any other, and so of course we want to have rules and laws in how we govern them, but we have to look at it in a way where people have an incentive to be able to want to take risks and move out and explore. And if there is anything worth observing and capturing in terms of extraterrestrial biology and things like that, we're going to get a lot further and a lot faster in finding and identifying these things if the private sector is a part of it than if you simply have the government. So the big issue becomes is that if you end up with onerous restrictions on what you can do as far as even if you can't visit Mars, first of all, I just don't see how that's enforceable. If how are you going to stop that? And more importantly is a question of, do you want to? And the example I come back to is I always look at a lot of this is similar to the gold rush. And there's a great book out there about the gold rush called "And the World Rushed In" that chronicles, at least from one man's perspective, and then a historian who writes around it, the history of the early years of the gold rush. And one of the things that the book points out in there is what would have happened if the discovery that was made at Sutter's Mill was made in another country. For example, if it had been made 3 years early when California was still Mexico or technically under the Spanish crown. And so the argument sort of put forth in there that I think that the gold rush really does make a great example of is that if this had been the province of kings or some sort of controlling government that wanted to preserve whatever was there, you would have never had all of the benefits of the gold rush, and you ended up with amount of wealth and growth and innovation, not only immediately in the hills around the Sierra Nevadas, but also created the city of San Francisco. Turned it from a very small town to a booming metropolis on the other side of the world, along with all of the other ancillary benefits. And you can even argue that further led to what happened in the silver boom, which you ended up making even more money. And so the point being is that you can have all of these resources and all these great opportunities, but if they're locked up by some government, you're never going to be able to access whatever wealth, and more importantly also what you want to preserve. And so I'll just add one last part to that is that you also have to look at, I think, conservation from, I guess, for me, a more traditional point of view. And one of the points of conservation of nature that John Muir always made, that other environmentalists disagreed with him about, was that you cannot, people will not want to preserve nature if they cannot experience it. And so this was his argument for wanting to have parks and give people access to that. And so there's no incentive for anybody to want to preserve what's on Mars if they can't access it. And, you know, we certainly see that in lots of places with antiquities, especially in the Middle East right now, where a lot of these places are inaccessible by the Western world. And so we can make whatever rules we want, but in the end, the only people that are getting there are pirates and thieves. And so to me, that's the fear here is that if you ban access to Mars, you end up with only the pirates and thieves, and you don't preserve what it is you really intended to do, because in the end, we're not looking at what are the intentions of any law. We're looking at what are the consequences of it. So that's sort of my general overview and initial thoughts in thinking about this. So I look forward to your follow-ups or rebuttals or whatever else.
Yeah, great. I'd actually like to touch on one of the first comments you had made about the sort of disparity in relation to space investment between how much money the government is able to invest, and then how that then falls on the shoulders of the private sector and how they need an incentive to go to space. What do you see happening to that incentive for investment with the private sector if there might be uncertainty whether their future investments would be worthwhile, or if they begin to invest in something that turns out won't even be used because Mars would be illegal to travel to them?
Well, obviously that, you know, certainty is going to spur more investment to a certain extent. Now, if certainty is look, we know for the next 1,000 years you're not going to be allowed on there, that's probably not going to spur any kind of investment. But investors, when you're, you know, they're only willing to take so much risk. And so if you've got technical risk and then you've got financial risk, that's already usually enough for most investors. When you throw in regulatory risk, that becomes, you know, it's sort of like when they say fast, cheap, and good, you can pick 2 out of 3. And I think the way you look at it with regulatory risk, technical risk, and financial risk, you can, you know, investors will take 2 out of 3. They'll take regulatory and even capital risk if they, you know, if they know that there's an opportunity there. You know, if they know that technically you can do it and the laws allow you, and now it's just a matter of I got to risk my money, I'll do it. Or if it's a situation where technically they may not be able to do it, but they know if they can do, for biotechnology, for example, big technical risks, but they know that if they do certain things, they will make a lot of money, right? Biotechnology starts, a lot of drug discovery start with an investment of $5–10 million, but by the time it snowballs to an actual drug, there's hundreds of millions in there, in it. And so in that case, they know they're willing to take the financial risk and the technical risk that it might not work out because they know that there is a big market there. If we know that there is no big upside here on Martian resources or anything else like that, then the technical risk and the financial risk is going to hurt everyone. And I think there is one point to be made about the technical risk, especially with going to Mars, is that, you know, I'm sure, I don't know what, my guess is that if you asked even Elon Musk, he would say, we don't have the technology today to go to Mars. There was a book that came out about 10 years ago that made this argument, and I think it makes it quite well, that, you know, keeping all of the risks that you have to do to keep people alive on Mars, we don't know how to solve all of them. That doesn't mean that they won't be solved, but with the technology that we have today, even if we had all the money in the world, we're probably, you're probably taking a risk that you know, most people wouldn't be willing to make. So to get back to sort of the original point, you know, you have to have regulatory risk can only be tolerated if there's a sure thing in terms of the financial upside, and they think they have a path on the technical risk. You know, there are businesses that are built on regulatory risk, but that's only because there's lots of other things that are easy, and space is nowhere near that as a business proposition. Certainly anything beyond low Earth orbit, you can, you know, you have tremendous technical risk. There is tremendous financial risk. And so the more regulatory certainty you can have that whatever investment you make can be recouped, then becomes something that people can begin to build a business case around.
So it seems like in terms specific to space development, the regulatory risk is probably even more important, just because the financial and technology risks are already granted.
Yeah. So the example I give is that, you know, I worked on getting the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act passed. And so when we originally started working on that bill around like 2002, 2003, there was uncertainty as to whether or not launch vehicles that have wings on them would be regulated as an airplane or as a rocket. If they were regulated as a rocket, then, you know, you can live with that. But again, if it's regulated with an airplane, it's much, much harder. No one really wanted that except for one person who changed his mind later. But for the most part, no one wanted to go through the airplane regulatory process. And so the fact that no one knew where it stood impeded the industry. And so one of the things the bill fixed was to let you know which regulatory regime you were in. And so the law says something about the thrust exceeding the lift on the vehicle. And so that provides a pretty firm line from an engineering standpoint of what is a launch vehicle and what is an airplane. And in originally when the law was written in the 80s, you know, launch vehicles were just converted ICBMs. They were just traditional rockets. They didn't have wings. And so all of a sudden, when you started having people creating rocket-powered airplanes, essentially, or rocket-powered wings, rockets with wings, whatever you wanted to call them, and in fact, no one wanted to call them airplanes because of the regulatory regime for certificated airplanes was too onerous. Airplanes have a 100-year history. The regulations are based on that. And so to apply those rules to rockets was not going to be good for the industry. And so it was able to create a dividing line. So I think you know, those kinds of dividing lines of which side of the rules am I going to be on, it certainly helps with the investment climate. You know, you're never going to be able to end all uncertainty because obviously laws can be changed down the road. So no matter what do you do now, down the road somebody may decide differently. But if at least you know what the regulatory basis is, it gives you a better place to start from. And more importantly, most laws are just simply, whenever you pass at least a federal law, it's just a change on a previous law, right? You know, if you look at the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act, it amended the Commercial Space Act. The Commercial Space Act probably amended something else in the CFR. And so, you know, by the time you look at most laws, they're just red lines of a previous law. And so in this case, there's probably lots of law you could argue that could or could not apply to the current regime of property rights in space. So, for example, I know some people are trying to, Bigelow and some of those guys are trying to work with the FAA to try and come up with sort of a, by default, kind of property right through FAA licenses, where the license gives them a right to, I think it's a certain patch of lunar territory or something. And so there's a lot of, I'm sure, so even being able to clarify what's under existing law and where you fall under existing law or what path you're going to take can be of help in regulatory certainty.
Kind of touching on that, the confusion over which regulations a company might be meeting. Some of the research I've seen, and some people would say that just because we haven't discovered any life worth preserving or anything that would fall under this sort of ethical preservation or preservation ethic, business plans would just continue unaffected in the absence of any of these discoveries. My question then would be about the announcement of this new international law. How would that announcement, not necessarily the finding of any microbial life, but the announcement of just a new legislation, how would that affect private business? You had just mentioned that there is confusion over whether or not you fit in the current regulations and how that will affect future regulations. Is that something then companies would take into account? They wouldn't just brush it off because there hasn't been any life found yet.
I mean, I would certainly, if not argue against the premise, certainly chip away against the premise that we don't know what kind of life exists on there. For example, based on what we know so far about Mars, we know certainly what kind of life may exist on there. You know, and it's going to be single cell kind of, you know, we can kind of put a box around what kind of life we know is going to be on Mars based on the fact, even though we haven't seen it yet. right? Or, you know, and so you can do that in a lot of these cases of, by looking at a planet and certain things, you can know what kind of potential life is there, and then be able to then work backwards to what is it if we are trying to preserve something, you can't just say we don't know, because the reality is that, well, you can find out. So I think that, so assuming then that before you go and disturb some sort of new world or something like that, you already know something about it, you can begin to prepare and make some sort of reasonable compromise of, just like you do on Earth, of preserving it, which, by the way we preserve wildlife in this country, I would not recommend for any new endeavor, right? Because a lot of the way a lot of development is done now is they do trade-offs, right? Where, for example, if I want to build, there was a fight years ago, they wanted to extend the runways in San Francisco airport. And so in return, they were going to buy a bunch of marshland. And everywhere you turn, every development, environmental and sensitive areas in at least in this country, most of the time is offset by building a park or buying a preserve somewhere else. And so you end up with a lot of these little patches everywhere without any thinking about cohesive ecosystems and everything. And so instead of having one big park that could sustain, you know, certain kinds of larger animals, you have a whole bunch of disconnected parks. So certainly saying that whatever, you know, you can't call the rules that we've put in this country a huge success, you know, on either side, especially if you're looking at wanting to preserve what native life was there. I guess you know, so my point is that if we know something ahead of time about these worlds, then I think you can begin to specify, if you are going to have some sort of regulations, it would be remiss to just make them blanket for every world as everything the same. You know, we know there's a lot less chance of life on the moon by the fact of simple observation and you know, understanding of what's there. And so the rules on the moon might be a lot different from Mars. You know, so you can understand things. Now, obviously, the other flip side to that is that there is, you know, at some point we may end up discovering a form of life that we are incapable of understanding. But then to say that we're capable, but then that also begs the question of how are we capable of making rules to protect something we don't understand? So if your simple rule is just, you know, I guess, yeah, I mean, it's always safe to not do anything. That's always the safest thing on anything. And the space business certainly is not based on that. It is based on calculated risks and going forward, accepting those risks. I mean, you know, even airplanes you take every day today, is that if we flew and operated airports and airplanes exactly by the book, half the flights every day would be canceled. Right? But we assume, hey, people are smart, the pilots are competent, they'll soldier through. And so you end up taking risks, you know, and so, and it's very much the same thing in space, and will probably continue to be for the near future. It's a very harsh environment.
I'd like to touch briefly on a comment you had made actually a little bit ago concerning just the acceptance of international law by other countries. For example, if it's the United States pushing this topic and resolution, what incentive would China have to not stake land on Mars if they were to get there, or not further develop their ships to Mars? Some people have written that globalization of the commercialization of space, there's a variety of cultural differences guiding these international business ethics. If we then adopt a single ethic, how do you think other countries would react to that? And is it enforceable? Is the real question.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it comes. I mean, you have certainly a community of nations that cooperates on big things, and I don't know too much about what governs space law and where it is and everything else like that. But the reality is that there is a consensus. You know, there is agreement on space, and so most of the nations follow that. To me, if you look at, for example, antiquities and preserving those in the Middle East, for example, is something my sister is involved in. And there, your problem really isn't so much countries as it is sort of the phrase I always love that oh God, what's the guy who Thomas Friedman, Lexus and the Olive Tree uses. He uses this example, the superpowered individual, and you know, whether it's someone like Bin Laden or Donald Trump or just somebody with a bunch of money who can do whatever the hell they want, oftentimes can have the same amount of power as many nations, and so to me, those are going to be the harder ones to preserve, because how do you deter someone that can basically go and do, how do you deter Somali pirates and the space equivalent of that? And so to me, it's not so much, I mean, nations will have their agreements, and yeah, they'll probably cheat on them here and there or whatever else like that, but there's a framework for coming up with those rules, and hopefully, this debate, along with many others, will be part of a process of coming up with reasonable rules. But the reality is that you're going to have people who don't follow those rules. And so part of the reason why Somali pirates are able to survive out in the middle of the Horn of Africa is because nobody else wants to be there, and no one else is there, and there's no one who can come and help you. But the reality is that the Somali pirates don't operate in the middle of the Mediterranean. They could, right? But the reality is that there's help is close by. There are lots of people there. There's lots of development. In the Horn of Africa, there isn't any. And so deterring those kinds of if you make Mars just as populated as the Horn of Africa, where no one wants to go or no one is allowed to go, then the only people who are going to rescue you from the Somali pirates are going to be the other Somali pirates. So to me, that's an incentive that's why you want to have orderly, law-abiding people there, so that it's easier to enforce whatever reasonable rules that you've come up with.
Interesting, but you sort of see it as if a group of countries are held away from Mars and legally bound, someone's still going to get there eventually, whether or not it's a country that follows the international regime or not. Yeah,
I would say that, yeah, that there are enough. It has a lot of I think it goes to be saying, when you have the sort of the question of why Mars and everything else like that, there's a lot of appeal there, because it's probably the closest to being able to sustain a long-term civilization. That if we're gonna pick a place, you got, as far as where to start out with, you've got the moon, which has the advantage of being closer, but it has no atmosphere. It may have water in the craters, we don't know, but you have to drill down to preserve. One of the big issues for how do you keep people outside of the Van Allen? The big question is, how do you keep people outside of the Van Allen belts, right? And that's protecting people from radiation. We don't know how to do it. There's lots of ideas that range from shielding them with lead and water to using electromagnetic type of shielding, to even changing of human genetics to make people radiation tolerant. But the reality is that, even in low Earth orbit, you get pretty high doses of radiation, and it can have a bad effect on people. And the second you get out of the Van Allen belts, you got to find shelter quick. And in the moon, you can do that by digging down. On Mars, you've got somewhat of an atmosphere. You've got closer to Earth's gravity to it. And so if you're going to find a place to live in space, if you're going to look around the neighborhood, it's you've got Earth is number one, and Mars would probably be number two if getting there isn't as much of a problem. So to me, there is a certain inevitability to, if you believe that it is inevitable that we will become a spacefaring civilization, that people will live in space, then it's more than inevitable. It is certainly probable that Mars will be one of those populated places. If you don't believe if you believe we're just going to stay on this Earth, then that's a premise that we can, of separate debate. But if you believe humans are going to live in space, they are going to live on Mars, and simply because it's one of the easiest places to do it.
And what do you? I know your job isn't really focused on this sort of theoretical thinking, but what do you had touched on the idea of the necessity or the idea of a long-term civilization on Mars, getting there so we can have some form of sustainable resources that we haven't achieved on Earth yet, or that we're dwindling down. What do you think on that topic? Do you think that's important to have sort of that planet outside of Earth, and and do you think that'll happen whether or not we continue developing to explore other planets?
I think certainly the probability has increased dramatically by the fact of the success of SpaceX, and the fact that obviously somebody with a lot of resources, both has a lot of resources, is committing to do this regardless of whether the government does this. U.S. government has said it's a goal. I'm sure other foreign governments have said it, and who knows? There's probably other billionaires out there who'd love to pick up where Elon left off. But the reality is that there is a lot of momentum to there. As far as I won't get into too much. I'm probably not. There are probably higher level sort of ethical debates of I think other people have made the arguments better for why humanity should be there, why we should be a multi-planet species, why we need to have frontiers, why we need to explore. These are all things that other people, I think, can make the arguments. Other people have made those arguments quite well, and I think those arguments do stand, that we have an obligation. My favorite one is Larry Niven wrote a short intro to one of my dad's books called Step Farther Out, and in it, his whole premise is that he wants people to go to space, not because he necessarily wants to go to space, but because he wants to see the Earth turn back into a nice park with lots of trees and everything, and that he can walk around Earth on his Kelty with his Kelty backpack and experience Earth in a much nicer way. As people have moved to space. So he, along with Elon Musk and other people, have made lots of arguments for the why we should go. I think the inevitability, or at least the chances of it happening, have dramatically increased by the fact that now you don't just have to rely on the government to do it. That clearly here's a multi-billion-dollar business that's dedicated simply to this premise. And so there's still a lot of work to be done on how you get there, but I think the probability of it in my mind is quite high, and has gotten higher over the past 10 years.
Awesome. Touching back briefly, I had read just of a NanoRacks article of a stash and deploy 3D printing, I believe is the technology used. And something interesting I read was that it would eventually be working to have the ability to create spaceships in space. I read that's a final idea of its purpose. And then I got to thinking, I think there's a lot of research out right now that says, if we develop a preservation ethic, we shouldn't go to Mars. That doesn't really affect smaller scale tech development in space. That just would affect, spaceship research getting to Mars, for example, and other development of space would kind of go unharmed. It seems like a lot of smaller scale tech development in space, it kind of is geared towards those future discoveries, dual use, being able to create something that would help us discover other planets or further in space. Do you think those smaller, even those smaller technologies would be affected by a resolution like this, or they'd kind of be able to go unharmed?
Well, I think you can look at a lot of the current crop of people who are putting in either time or money or both into developing what right now would be considered smaller projects. But many of them, many of the people invested in this are starting with the premise that, yeah, this is going to lead to something else. If you look at most of the people who've invested in, many of the Google Lunar X Prize teams or programs, they're looking at it from a perspective that that's not the end point. Bob Bigelow has said that his investment is clearly for something bigger. Elon Musk has said the whole purpose of his multi-billion-dollar enterprise is for this purpose. Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure you could say this, and even small CubeSats, for example, we launched CubeSats for people who are looking at doing things like mining asteroids and things like that. And these things are starting with small CubeSats, the size of a loaf of bread, and So yeah, if there was more uncertainty or bad news on the front of their ability to be able to harvest whatever it is that they're going after, most of the business plans are under the premise of start small, build a business, but eventually move towards some sort of larger goal. And most of those goals involve being a spacefaring civilization, having people living in space. And so these things, whether they be Earth observation satellites, radios, small tests, most of them are for the purpose of advancing us towards that. And so the harder you make it, it would have an effect downstream in my mind.
And just sort of as an overall comment then on that, what do you foresee happening then to space investment? I know it's a huge industry. I'm not sure what part of the global economy or even the U.S. national economy goes into space exploration and development, but what consequences then do you see down the line if it not only starts small but blocks larger investments? What does that look like?
Well, it's funny because I think I view, and I'm probably not the only one, but I'm probably one of the few that's expressed it this way. I view a lot of this whole concept of being a spacefaring civilization as sort of a dialectic, as inevitability, in the same way that the socialists would feel, it's inevitable, and so whatever we do is simply either postponing or accelerating the inevitable. And to me, barring some unfortunate consequence on Earth of some sort of horrible tragedy, that it's inevitable that we will be a spacefaring civilization. And so the consequence of delaying that is simply, well, not simply, but I mean the consequence is delaying the benefits of that, of having the potential for a cleaner Earth by moving polluting industries off, by having the ability to access unlimited energy, the ability to be able to access new resources, the ability to be able to discover new life. Those things are going to be impeded by the fact if you're holding back the private sector. I mean, I would argue that that with a misguided attempt to preserve life, you could end up harming life on these other planets, because you're simply going to be holding back the ability to go and discover these things, and our ability then to be able to preserve or manage or having any kind of stewardship over whatever resources that we find in these places is going to be hindered by the fact that people aren't going to want to invest in this. They're going to turn inward and trying to make the most out of what they have here, when in fact they could end up doing twice as much by having access to a lot more. So, our motto at our business is that if you're thinking globally, you're thinking too small.
Well, fantastic. Yeah, I really appreciated that. I'm trying to think if there's any other spots that we can touch on. Did you have any just general comments that you wanted to end with? I know sometimes we ask if our interviewee has not taken a final strong stand, that we ask them to sort of take a stand on a single side. It seems like you have already. Are there any final comments you wanted to kind of get in before closing out the interview?
I mean, I guess I would say is I would not rule out reasonable restrictions on how you approach or how you prepare or anything else like that. That's part of life now. I think one of a good example to look at is how much good is really done by current environmental assessments that are done. And so I think there has to be, if you're going to assume that we're going to try and come up with some sort of reasonable regulations, you're not just going to take the extreme on either side of either we're let anybody do what they want, or let's restrict Mars and no one can go there, and it's just going to end up, it's not even going to be a park, it's just going to be a fenced off area over there. Assuming you're somewhere in the middle on that, then I think you really have to take a look at what has worked in terms of these kinds of rules and things like that. And so, for example, and so you can say and so the example I always come back to is the gold rush. And so you can say what you want about the horrors of free market capitalism and the destruction of the environment, but last I checked, California is still better off environmentally than a lot of other places, and they unlocked a lot of wealth out of there, and they dug a lot of it out of the ground, and they threw a lot of people into that place. And it's not some it's not some environmental hellhole. And so and it's also not devoid of all industry, as people on the other side would probably look at it and say. But the reality is that I think you have to look at what's worked and what hasn't in previous times. And so for example, in the case of the gold rush, here you have something where you had essentially American-style capitalism, and you didn't end up with, a complete collapse of civilization and, an environment that no one wanted to live in. You ended up with probably one of the most desirable places in the world. And so I would hope that whatever reasonable regulations you came up with for being able to do business on Mars, you would end up with the same thing.
So maybe instead of an overriding ethical obligation, like the topic says, it'd be something like a reasonable ethical obligation, a case-by-case basis, you would say.
Yeah, or a reasonably managed, or I mean, you can we can talk all we want about whatever ethical obligations, but in the end, when you write laws, you compromise whatever ethical obligations. If you write law, we could always lower speeding limit laws, and so if we have some ethical obligation to preserve life over all else, then the speed limit would be 25 everywhere, but it isn't. And so I don't think I would, so I would argue against the premise that there is some sort of overriding ethical obligation that eliminates the ability to come up with reasonable compromises, or at least reasonable regulations.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. I appreciate it. If there's nothing else that you wanted to sort of add, I just wanted to thank you for your time. It was great kind of getting a chance to sit down and pick through some of your ideas on this. I really appreciate it.
No, it's a fun topic. I look forward to doing it. I look forward to being able to judge and look and see a card that I wrote. So I think that'd be cool. As a debater, that's really all you want, is that you want to be. I don't know if anybody still quotes Paul Ehrlich, but he was always like the famous one. Species destruction is going to end the world, and then it was something else that's going to end. He's got some latest now of it. He's still doing it 30 years later. So maybe I can end up being the Paul Ehrlich of space here. So
maybe one day.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, Richard.
All right. Thanks for doing this. And I look forward to seeing the debates and everything.
Great. We'll see you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.